In the 20th century, humanity endured a catastrophic war, the wounds of which remain deeply etched in the consciousness of many nations and peoples around the world. The war, lasting nearly 6 years and involving over 30 countries, was truly a total war. The warring nations poured all their economic, military, scientific, and industrial resources into the effort to achieve victory. Countless horrifying massacres and genocides took place alongside bloody battles. The aftermath it left behind was utterly horrifying, with the death toll rising to over 70 million people and hundreds of millions more affected. National economies collapsed, and the majority of industrial infrastructure was destroyed. After all was said and done, the pain of war still lingered acutely for generations in the affected countries. The world order was also rewritten by this catastrophic conflict. In this video, let's briefly and simply review the entire course of the Second World War. Let's begin. From the First World War to the Second World War. The start of the war in Europe is often considered to be Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, followed 2 days later by Britain and France declaring war on Germany. On the Pacific Front, however, some believe that the World War actually began when Japan invaded China on July 7, 1937. There are even opinions that World War II started as far back as 1931, with Japan's invasion of Manchuria on September 19th. But in truth, the Second World War did not begin in just a day or two, or because of 1 or 2 events. It was the result of a continuous chain of events that had been occurring since before the First World War even ended. The Second World War was a collection of many conflicts. Although most were nation versus nation confrontations, the international-scale civil war between the left and right also played an equally important role, and even influenced many of those conflicts. It's difficult to summarize the causes of World War II in just a few sentences, because the reasons for the outbreak of the most brutal and fierce war the world had ever known differed in each region. The terrible impacts of the First World War had left even victorious nations like France and Britain exhausted, and they were determined that, at all costs, a repeat of such an event would not happen again. Central Europe was fragmented by new borders drawn at the Versailles Conference, and it suffered the humiliation and destitution that defeat brought. The pride of Austro-Hungarian soldiers and officers was shattered. The Germans were even more bitter because until July 1918, their army had been undefeated. This made becoming a defeated nation an incredibly hard pill to swallow. Then the hyperinflation of 1923 to 1924 further crippled Germany. The bitterness born from national and personal humiliation gave rise to a colossal rage. German nationalists yearned for the day they could avenge the shame of their defeat. Life in Germany improved in the latter half of the 1920s, mainly thanks to large loans from the United States. Then the worldwide depression, which began after the Wall Street crash of 1929, dealt an even heavier blow to the country when Britain and other nations abandoned the gold standard in September 1931. The fear of another round of hyperinflation forced Chancellor Brüning's government to maintain the Reichsmark's value against gold, causing the currency to be severely overvalued. American loans stopped. Protectionism blocked Germany's access to export markets, leading to rampant unemployment. This situation significantly increased the opportunity for extremists to rise. The crisis of capitalism accelerated the crisis of liberal democracy. Most of the parliamentary systems that emerged after the collapse of Europe's 3 empires at the end of World War I were not strong enough to cope with civil conflicts and ethnic minorities. These groups, which had been relatively stable under the old imperial regimes, were now threatened by theories of national and ethnic purity. The terrible memory of the Russian Revolution and the horrific civil wars in Hungary, Finland, the Baltic states, and even in Germany itself pushed political polarization to a new high. Conservatism and revisionism emerged in several European countries. This trend was particularly strong in Germany. In Germany, the empire was dissolved in the 1918 to 1919 revolution, and a democratic government called the Weimar Republic was established. The subsequent period saw conflict between supporters of the young republic and its uncompromising opponents from both the left and the right. Another country, Italy, as an allied nation of the victorious Entente powers, did gain some territory. However, Italian nationalists were enraged when Britain and France did not fully deliver on the promises they made when persuading Italy to join the war against the Central Powers. As a result, from 1922 to 1925, the fascist movement led by Benito Mussolini came to power in Italy. Mussolini's government used nationalism as a pretext to implement a totalitarian regime, abolishing parliamentary democracy and suppressing socialist, leftist, and liberal forces. Italy shifted to pursuing an aggressive, expansionist foreign policy aimed at turning the country into a world power, a new Roman Empire. Returning to Germany, the power of the National Socialist Party, or the Nazi Party, which also followed fascism, gradually grew. The Nazi Party led by Adolf Hitler had attempted a violent putsch in Bavaria in 1923 to overthrow the local government and then march on to topple the Weimar Republic. Although the coup failed, it helped make Hitler's name famous throughout the country. Many saw him as a great patriot and a German national hero. Gradually, the power of the Nazi Party in general, and Hitler in particular, grew stronger. By September 1930, the vote share for the Nazi Party had increased from 2.5% to 18.3%. Finally, in 1933, Hitler officially became the Chancellor of Germany and later the Führer. He quickly moved to eliminate his rivals, abolish democracy, and harbored ambitions to change the world order, elevating the status of the German nation and state. Hitler's greatest talent lay in his ability to recognize and exploit his opponent's weaknesses. The left wing in Germany, after splitting into the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party, was no longer a real threat. Hitler could easily manipulate the naive and arrogant conservatives who thought they had him under control. Immediately after consolidating his position and power in Germany, Hitler turned to challenging and breaking the Treaty of Versailles. Germany reintroduced conscription in 1935. Its navy was strengthened and an air force was established. Initially, Britain, France, and Italy formed the Stresa Front in April 1935 to contain a remilitarizing Germany. However, just 2 months later, Britain negotiated a separate naval agreement with Germany, loosening previous restrictions. Fearing Germany's territorial ambitions in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union drafted a mutual assistance treaty with France. Another country, the United States, also grew concerned about the tense developments in Europe and Asia. Consequently, the U.S. Congress passed the Neutrality Acts in August of the same year. In March 1936, Hitler openly challenged and violated the Versailles and Locarno treaties by sending troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. This action was like a slap in the face to France, which had occupied the region for over a decade. It also caused admiration for the Führer to spread throughout Germany, even among those who had not voted for him. This support, combined with the appeasement and weak reactions from European countries, only encouraged Hitler to push further. Inside Germany, Hitler began to persecute and discriminate against Jewish people. Abroad, he was eager to realize his ambition of turning all of Central Europe and the entire territory of Russia up to the Volga River into German territory to secure Germany's status as a superpower. Hitler even intervened in the Spanish Civil War, helping Francisco Franco's fascist side to victory. The Spanish Civil War also helped bring the two fascist nations, Germany and Italy, closer together. In October 1936, Germany and Italy formed the Rome-Berlin Axis. At the same time, hoping for more allies in the upcoming war against the Soviet Union, Hitler established the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan in November 1936. A year later, Italy also joined this pact, gradually forming the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. In Asia at that time, Japan had been expanding its colonies in the Far East since the late 19th century. Taking advantage of the weakness of the Qing dynasty in China, Japan established a presence in Manchuria, seized the island of Taiwan and the Korean peninsula. Then, its victory over Russia in the 1904 to 1905 war turned Japan into the strongest military power in the region. Meanwhile, in China, after the success of the Xinhai Revolution and the end of the Qing dynasty, the country quickly fell into a state of chaotic civil war between various factions. In the mid-1920s, the Kuomintang launched the Northern Expedition with the goal of unifying China and eliminating the power of the regional warlords. Although the campaign was successful and China was unified, Chiang Kai-shek's government soon fell into a civil war with the Communist Party. However, later, in late 1936, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire and cooperated to resist the increasing aggression of Japan. In September 1931, the Japanese army orchestrated the Mukden incident, blowing up a section of railway to create a pretext to occupy all of Manchuria. Japan's goal was to turn Manchuria into a breadbasket to feed the homeland. They established the so-called Manchukuo, setting up a puppet government for the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, Puyi, who had abdicated in 1912 when the revolution succeeded in China. In response, China asked the League of Nations to impose sanctions on Japan, but was refused. Nevertheless, Japan's actions in Manchuria also led to its diplomatic isolation. But that did nothing to deter the ambitions of the hawkish military faction within the Japanese government. The Japanese army began to eye the Soviet Union and cast its gaze toward the South Pacific, targeting the far eastern colonies of Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Simultaneously, relations between Japan and China grew increasingly tense, ultimately leading to the Marco Polo Bridge incident. On July 7, 1937, the armies of both sides opened fire on each other, and the Second Sino-Japanese War officially began. Back in Europe, the general attitude of many countries towards an increasingly aggressive Germany with an ever-growing military was one of relative caution and wishful thinking. Many even saw Nazi Germany as a shield against Bolshevism. Others were reluctant to confront Hitler's regime, believing that Germany had been treated too unfairly at the Versailles Conference. Above all, the leading European powers, Britain and France, feared another pan-European war. Turning a blind eye to Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria in March 1938 seemed like a small price to pay to maintain world peace. Hitler then decided he wanted to invade Czechoslovakia in September of that year. But before Hitler could find a pretext for war, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier signed the Munich Agreement with Germany, agreeing to cede the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Germany in hopes of preserving peace. Hitler, though deprived of his chance to go to war in 1938, found this outcome only beneficial for Germany. Chamberlain made another crucial mistake by refusing to consult with Stalin. Chamberlain believed that he alone could persuade Hitler that maintaining peace and good relations with the Western countries would be advantageous, but he clearly misjudged Hitler's ambitions. This very act contributed to the Soviet Union signing a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in August 1939. This pact was not an alliance agreement but a temporary truce between two rival nations, to postpone an immediate war. Germany wanted to attack Poland and then France first, so it needed to prevent Soviet intervention, while the Soviet Union also needed to buy time to strengthen its military. Some historians have suggested that if Britain and France had been willing to fight in the autumn 1938, things might have been different. That might be true, at least from the German perspective, but in reality, the people of both Britain and France were not psychologically ready for war, largely because they were misled by appeasement-minded politicians. Anyone who tried to warn of the danger of war and Hitler's ambitions at the time, such as Winston Churchill, was branded a warmonger. And it wasn't until November 1938 that people's eyes were opened to the true nature of Hitler's regime.
Following the assassination of a German embassy official in Paris by a young Polish Jew, Nazi special forces carried out a pogrom against Jews throughout Germany and Austria. This event, later known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, left hundreds dead and tens of thousands arrested and sent to concentration camps. Then, in March 1939, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, a flagrant violation of the Munich Agreement. Hitler's ambition to dominate Europe was now too obvious to ignore. European countries, led by Britain and France, immediately changed their stance and warned Hitler not to push any further. But after signing the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union that August, Hitler was completely free to start the war he had long craved. In retrospect, the cycle of resentment from the Treaty of Versailles seemed to make the outbreak of another world war inevitable. The consequences of the First World War created instability and tension across Europe and Asia. But it must be said that Adolf Hitler was the one eager to start a new and much more terrible fire to serve his ambitions. War breaks out in Europe. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland after staging a series of incidents, including one where Polish soldiers allegedly set fire to a German radio station in Gliwice. The first German attack targeted Poland's defenses at Westerplatte. In response to Germany's military aggression, Britain sent an ultimatum demanding that Germany immediately halt the attack. After the ultimatum was rejected by Germany, both Britain and France declared war on September 3rd. Although they had declared war, Britain and France took no significant military action to help Poland. Britain remained almost completely inactive, while France only conducted a small-scale military probe into the Saarland region. Additionally, the Allied powers began a naval blockade of Germany with the aim of attacking its economy and curbing its military actions. Nazi Germany quickly retaliated by deploying submarines to attack Allied ships. The conflict at sea gradually escalated, turning into a series of seesaw battles between the sides that lasted until the end of World War II. On September 8, 1939, Nazi German troops reached the outskirts of Warsaw. A counterattack by the Polish army in the west held the Germans back for a few days, but they were soon outflanked and surrounded by German forces. Remnants of the Polish army broke through the encirclement to return and defend the besieged city of Warsaw. But then, on September 17th, after signing an armistice with Japan, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland. The Soviets used the pretext of protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians, claiming the Polish state had collapsed and was no longer able to protect its people. Furthermore, the Soviet Union declared that it was no longer bound by its non-aggression pact with Poland, as the Polish government no longer existed. By September 27th, the garrison in the capital, Warsaw, surrendered to the Germans, and on October 6th, the last major regular Polish force also surrendered. Despite this, the Polish government decided not to surrender and formed a government in exile. A large number of Polish soldiers evacuated to Romania and the Baltic states, and many of them would later continue to fight against the Axis powers on other fronts. After the fall of Poland, Germany quickly annexed the western part of the country and occupied the central part of the country, while the eastern part was annexed by the Soviet Union. A small portion of Polish territory was transferred to Lithuania and Slovakia. Hitler did not immediately announce the dissolution of the Polish state, hoping that what had happened might persuade Britain and France to reach an agreement. The fact that the Allies did not send troops to help Poland led Hitler to believe that Britain and France didn't really want to continue the war. On October 5th, after receiving a welcome at a victory parade in Warsaw, Hitler told foreign journalists, "Gentlemen, you have seen the ruins of Warsaw. Let this be a warning to the statesmen in London and Paris who are still thinking of continuing the war." The next day, he announced his desire for public peace negotiations with Britain and France, but insisted that the future of the Polish state would be decided by Germany and the Soviet Union. However, Hitler's proposal was rejected by both Britain and France, so he immediately wanted to send troops to attack France. But in the end, the campaign was postponed until the spring of 1940 due to unfavorable weather. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union also sought to exert influence over the Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Stalin forced these countries to sign a mutual assistance pact, allowing the Soviet Union to station troops on their territory. But Finland refused to sign this pact and also refused to cede part of its territory. Negotiations dragged on until November without reaching a final agreement. Therefore, Stalin decided to attack Finland. The Soviet Union severed all diplomatic relations with Finland on November 29th and launched an invasion the very next day. This action led to the Soviet Union's expulsion from the League of Nations 2 weeks later. Despite its overwhelming numerical superiority, the Soviet Union achieved only very modest military successes. Although it paid a heavy price, the Soviet Union could ultimately be considered to have achieved its goal when Finland ceded the Karelian region to the Soviets.
By June 1940, the Soviet Union used force to annex the territories of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and some disputed territories with Romania. During this period, the political and economic cooperation between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union also began to break down. After all, the non-aggression pact signed by the two countries 2 years prior was only a temporary measure to prepare for war. Hitler's ambition had always been to swallow the entire eastern part of Russia, and thus a clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was inevitable. Western Europe and the Mediterranean. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway to protect the iron ore shipping route from Sweden, which the Allies were trying to cut off. Denmark surrendered after only a few hours of fighting, and Norway fell 2 months later, even with support from Allied forces. The failure to save Norway also led to public discontent in Britain. Neville Chamberlain had to resign, and Winston Churchill replaced him as Prime Minister on May 10th. On the same day, Germany also launched its campaign to attack France. To bypass the formidable Maginot Line along the Franco-German border, German forces diverted their attack through the neutral countries of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. German troops moved through the Ardennes forest, which the Allies had considered an impenetrable natural barrier for armored forces. Using blitzkrieg tactics, the German army advanced like a storm towards the English Channel. Outflanked and caught by surprise by the speed of the German advance, the bulk of the Allied army was surrounded at the Franco-Belgian border near Lille. To rescue these forces, Churchill launched Operation Dynamo, also known as the Dunkirk evacuation. Although they had to abandon almost all their equipment and weapons, the operation successfully rescued over 330,000 Allied soldiers. The losses were not small, but most importantly, the Allies had saved a large number of troops. On June 10th, Italy invaded France and declared war on Britain as well. Meanwhile, German forces quickly moved south, attacking the weakened French army, and finally, Paris fell on June 14th. 8 days later, France was forced to sign an armistice with Germany. France was divided into German and Italian occupation zones, and the Vichy government, a pro-Axis fascist regime, was established. To prevent the French fleet from being used to attack Allied forces, on July 3rd, Britain attacked the French fleet anchored near Mers el-Kabir, sinking many warships. Also in early July, German air units began air raids on Britain with bombing attacks targeting ships and ports. However, unable to defeat the Royal Air Force, Germany was forced to indefinitely postpone its planned invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Germany continued to increase its nighttime air raids on London and other major cities throughout 1940 and early 1941. Nevertheless, Germany could not prevent Britain from staying in the war, so the German Air Force's bombing campaign ended completely in May 1941. In late September 1940, Japan, Italy, and Germany signed the Tripartite Pact, officially forming the Axis powers. The pact stipulated that if any country attacked one of the Axis nations, the others would immediately join the war. By November, Hungary and Romania also joined the Axis. During this period, the United States had not yet directly entered the war, because until 1941, American public opinion still opposed direct military intervention. Even before the fall of France, Churchill had sent a telegram to President Roosevelt, hoping the U.S. would take action. Roosevelt responded sympathetically, but made no commitments. In December 1940, Roosevelt accused Hitler of planning to conquer the world and declared all negotiations with Germany to be futile. Although not officially at war, the U.S. had begun strategic planning for a full-scale offensive against Germany. In the Mediterranean. In early June 1940, the Italian Royal Air Force attacked and besieged the British island of Malta. From late summer to early autumn, Italy occupied British Somaliland and launched an invasion of the British colony of Egypt. In October, Italy sent troops to invade Greece,
but was repulsed, and the Italian army suffered heavy casualties. The Italian-Greek campaign ended within a few months, with Italian forces only capturing a few small territories. To support Italy, Germany launched attacks in the Balkans to prevent Britain from gaining a foothold there. If successful, British forces could have become a threat to the oil fields in Romania. On the other hand, if the Axis captured the Balkans, they could use it as a springboard to attack British territories in the Mediterranean region. In December 1940, Britain launched a counteroffensive against Italian forces in Egypt and East Africa, winning many victories. By early February 1941, Italy had lost control of eastern Libya. The Italian Navy also suffered heavy defeats from attacks by the British Royal Navy. The defeat of Italy and the risk of the Axis being driven out of Africa forced Germany to send an expeditionary force to North Africa to assist. In late February 1941, the German Afrika Korps, under the command of Erwin Rommel, launched counteroffensives driving back the British Commonwealth forces. In less than a month, Axis forces had advanced to western Egypt and besieged the port of Tobruk. In March 1941, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia also signed the Tripartite Pact. However, just 2 days later, the pro-German government of Yugoslavia was overthrown by pro-British nationalists. In response to this action, Germany invaded both Yugoslavia and Greece simultaneously in early April. In less than a month, both countries were forced to surrender. The airborne assault on the Greek island of Crete in late May marked the successful conclusion of Germany's Balkan campaign, with very few casualties. However, despite their swift victory, the Axis had to deal with fierce resistance from Yugoslav partisans, and that resistance lasted until the end of the war. On the Middle Eastern front, in May, British Commonwealth forces suppressed an uprising in Iraq that had been instigated by Nazi Germany through a fascist puppet government. From June to July, Commonwealth forces, with the support of the Free French government, established by Charles de Gaulle after France was occupied by Nazi Germany, attacked and took control of the French colonies of Syria and Lebanon. The Soviet Union is attacked. At this point, Nazi Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union were all preparing their next moves. Japan wanted to take advantage of the war in Europe to seize the rich resources of the Western colonial territories in Southeast Asia. As for the Soviet Union, wary of the growing tension with Germany, it signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in April 1941 to avoid fighting a two-front war against the Axis. Earlier, in late July 1940, Hitler had begun to consider invading the Soviet Union to annex the territories of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. However, many German generals thought it would be better to invite the Soviet Union to join the Tripartite Pact to create a Eurasian bloc to counter the Allied nations in general and the British Empire in particular. Therefore, in November, Germany and the Soviet Union held bilateral negotiations to determine whether the Soviet Union would join the Tripartite Pact. The Soviet Union expressed interest but demanded concessions from Finland, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Japan. Hitler did not accept these demands. The negotiations broke down, and Hitler issued a directive for forces to prepare for the invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, German forces, supported by Italian and Romanian army groups, launched Operation Barbarossa, advancing into Soviet territory. Finland and Hungary quickly joined the war on Germany's side. The main objectives of this campaign were the Baltic region, the capital, Moscow, and the territory of Ukraine. Hitler's ambition was to crush the Soviet Union, destroy communism, and expand the territory of the German Third Reich to provide the German people with what he called Lebensraum, meaning living space, by expelling the native populations from the occupied areas and exploiting the resources there for the war effort. Although the Soviet Union had made certain preparations, faced with the powerful German assault, the Soviet Supreme High Command was forced to adopt a strategic defense. Throughout the summer, German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, inflicting heavy losses in both manpower and materiel. However, by mid-August, the German High Command decided to temporarily halt the offensive of the exhausted Army Group Center after nearly 2 months of blitzkrieg advance. the Germans redirected the 2nd Panzer Army towards central Ukraine and Leningrad to reinforce the fronts there. Additionally, Nazi Germany achieved a major victory in the attack on Kyiv, nearly annihilating the Soviet southwestern front. This gave Germany a springboard to thrust deep into Crimea and the industrial region of eastern Ukraine. The concentration of German forces on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union meant that the Axis Army and most of its air force had left France and the central Mediterranean. In light of this situation, Britain made adjustments to its grand strategy. In July 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union formed a military alliance against Germany. By August, Britain and the United States jointly issued the Atlantic Charter, outlining their goals for the post-war world. Late that month, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded neutral Iran to secure the supply route of the Persian Corridor, control the oil fields there, and prevent the Axis from using Iran as a transit point to advance and seize the oil fields in Azerbaijan or even India. By October 1941, German forces had basically completed most of their operational objectives in Ukraine and the Baltic region, but had not yet captured Leningrad and Sevastopol. The German High Command decided to restart the offensive on Moscow, with the goal of capturing the city at all costs to break Soviet morale. After 2 months of fierce fighting in increasingly harsh weather conditions, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. However, by then, the Germans were exhausted and forced to halt their attack. Nazi Germany had captured a vast territory, but their campaign had failed to achieve its main objectives, as the 2 key cities of Leningrad and Moscow were still defended and held by the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the German army became bogged down on both fronts in long and brutal sieges, suffering enormous casualties. Unable to capture Moscow and pushed back by a Red Army counteroffensive, the Blitzkrieg phase of Germany's war in Europe came to an end. The Pacific Theater. In the Asia-Pacific region, even before the war broke out in Europe, relations between Japan and the United States had soured due to a series of aggressive actions by Japan. In 1931, Japan staged the Mukden Incident to occupy Manchuria from China. Then, in 1937, Japan staged the Marco Polo Incident to officially invade China, committing numerous serious war crimes such as the Nanjing Massacre. As a result, in 1939, the United States decided not to renew its bilateral trade treaty with Japan, as American public opinion opposed Japanese expansionism, leading to a series of economic sanctions against Japan. The U.S. government also enacted the Export Control Act, ending the export of chemicals, minerals, and parts used to manufacture weapons to Japan. The Sino-Japanese War gradually entered a stalemate during this period. The Chinese Nationalist Army launched a large-scale counteroffensive in early 1940. Then, in August, the Chinese Communist Party's army also launched a major campaign in central China. To increase pressure on China by cutting off its supply lines and to position its army for a potential war with Western powers, Japan invaded and occupied northern Indochina in September 1940. In July 1941, Japan sent troops to southern Indochina, threatening British and Dutch colonies in the Far East. The Western powers responded to this action by freezing all Japanese assets abroad and imposing a comprehensive oil embargo. At this time, Japan was planning to invade the Soviet Far East, intending to take advantage of the fact that the country was busy fighting off the German invasion in the West. However, due to the Western sanctions, Japan had to abandon this plan. Also, from early 1941, the United States and Japan had entered negotiations to improve their strained bilateral relations and end the war in China. During these talks, Japan made several proposals, but they were rejected by the U.S. as completely inadequate. The negotiations reached an impasse, and the war in China continued. During this period, Britain, the United States, and the Netherlands also secretly met to plan their defense in the event of a Japanese attack. U.S. President Roosevelt also reinforced the military presence in the Philippines and warned that the U.S. would respond if Japan took any military action against neighboring countries in the region. Stalemated in the war in China and affected by the blockades from Britain, the United States, and the Netherlands, Japan began preparing for total war. On November 20, 1941, the new cabinet under Prime Minister Hideki Tojo issued an ultimatum demanding that the United States end its aid to China and lift the embargo on oil and other resources to Japan. In return, Japan promised not to target Southeast Asia and to withdraw its troops from southern Indochina.
On November 26th, the U.S. replied by demanding that Japan withdraw from China unconditionally and sign a non-aggression pact with the Pacific powers. This meant Japan had to choose between abandoning its ambitions in China or seizing the natural resources it needed in the Dutch East Indies by force. The Japanese military had no intention of complying with the U.S. demand and began to draw up plans for an attack. Japan planned to quickly capture the Asian colonies of the Western powers to create a defensive perimeter extending to the Central Pacific. According to the plan, after succeeding, Japan would be free to exploit the resources of Southeast Asia while maintaining an active defense against the thinly spread Allied forces. To prevent American intervention while securing its defensive perimeter, Japan decided to proactively attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So, on December 7, 1941, Japan declared war on the United States and its allies by simultaneously attacking multiple strategic locations in the Pacific, such as Pearl Harbor, Guam, the Philippines, Malaya, Thailand, and Hong Kong. In response to these attacks, the United States and its allies declared war on Japan, and this also marks the official entry of the United States into World War II. Only the Soviet Union maintained its neutrality agreement with Japan, as it was stretched thin fighting the Germans. And because of the pact signed with Japan, Germany and several other Axis nations declared war on the United States. The Axis advance is halted. In early January 1942, the four major powers, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, along with representatives from 22 other Allied nations and governments in exile, jointly issued the Declaration by United Nations, thereby affirming the Atlantic Charter and agreeing that no country would be allowed to sign a separate peace treaty with the Axis powers. During 1942, the important issue for the Allies to clarify was what strategy they would pursue in this war. All agreed that the top priority was to defeat Nazi Germany. The United States supported a large-scale direct assault on Germany through French territory. The Soviet Union was also demanding that the other Allies open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure. But Britain argued for military operations in peripheral areas to wear down German strength and morale while supporting resistance forces in occupied countries. In parallel, the Allies would deploy large-scale air campaigns against Germany, followed by a major offensive primarily using armored divisions rather than a large-scale army. In the end, Britain persuaded the United States that landing in France in 1942 was impossible and risky. For the time being, Allied forces should focus on completely driving the Axis out of North Africa. On the Soviet-German front, despite facing a large-scale Red Army counteroffensive in early 1942 after failing to capture Moscow, German forces managed to halt the Soviet advance, retaining most of the territory they had captured the previous year. In June, after defeating the Soviets on the Kerch Peninsula and at Kharkov, Germany launched a southern offensive aimed at capturing the oil fields in the Caucasus and the Kuban steppe, while remaining stationary in the northern and central parts of the front. The Germans split Army Group South in two. Army Group A was ordered to advance to the lower Don River and strike southeast toward the Caucasus, while Army Group B would advance towards the Volga River. The Soviets decided to make a last stand at the city of Stalingrad on the west bank of the Volga to stop the German advance. By mid-November, Germany and the Soviet Union were still fighting for every street corner and building in Stalingrad, causing extremely heavy casualties on both sides. This was also when the harsh Russian winter arrived. After a long period of preparation, the Soviet Union launched a series of major operations such as Operation Mars and Operation Uranus
tightly encircling over 300,000 German troops in the Stalingrad pocket. By early February 1943, the Red Army had completely driven the Germans out of Stalingrad, pushing the Soviet-German front back to its position before the summer offensive. By mid-February, as the Soviet advance began to slow, the Germans, hoping to turn the tide, launched another attack on Kharkov, creating a salient around the city of Kursk. On the Western European and Mediterranean front, initially taking advantage and exploiting weaknesses in the command and combat operations of the U.S. Navy, the German Navy conducted harassment and sabotage of Allied maritime transport routes off the Atlantic coast. In North Africa, British Commonwealth forces launched a counter-offensive named Operation Crusader in November 1941, retaking all the territory previously captured by German-Italian forces. In response, German forces launched an attack in January 1942, pushing the British back to their positions at the Gazala line. The situation in this area temporarily quieted down as Germany began preparations for its next campaigns. Fearing that Japan might use bases in Madagascar as a springboard for attacks, Britain decided to send troops to occupy the island in May 1942. In Libya, Axis forces pushed the Allies deep into Egyptian territory before being stopped at El Alamein. In Europe, the Allies decided to launch raids on strategic targets, culminating in the bloody Dieppe raid. Despite being outnumbered, the Allies failed to capture the Dieppe beach and suffered heavy losses. This defeat once again reinforced the British generals' belief that their forces could not hold a beachhead if they landed in German-occupied territories at that time. But gradually, the fierce fighting on the Soviet-German front forced Nazi Germany to concentrate its troops there, leading to a significant thinning of its forces on other fronts. The German forces in North Africa were thus short of ammunition and fuel and could not continue their offensive. By August 1942, the Allied forces successfully halted another Axis offensive at El Alamein and then managed to resupply the island of Malta, which had been under siege since June 1940. A few months later, the Allies launched an offensive, driving the Axis forces out of Egypt and began advancing westward. In November 1942, the situation became even more dire for the Axis when the Allies launched Operation Torch, landing in Morocco and Algeria, surrounding the Axis forces. As a result, the Allies regained control of the French colonies in North Africa. In response, Hitler ordered German troops to occupy the territory of the Vichy French government. Although the Vichy army did nothing to oppose this violation of the armistice, they did try to scuttle their fleet to prevent it from falling into German hands. The Vichy government effectively became a puppet government of Nazi Germany, with power limited to civil policies.
Even so, the situation on the North African front did not improve much for the Axis. The Axis forces in Africa retreated to Tunisia and were finally driven out of North Africa in May 1943. Then, in June 1943, Britain and the United States began a strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The goal of these air campaigns was to demoralize the population, destroy civilian homes, and sabotage the German economy. On the Pacific Front, by April 1942, Japan and its ally Thailand had captured almost all of Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and Rabaul. Despite fierce resistance from Filipino and American troops, the Commonwealth of the Philippines was finally conquered by Japan in May 1942, forcing the Manila government into exile. In addition to its army, the Japanese Navy also won many victories in the South China Sea, the Java Sea, and the Indian Ocean. The Japanese fleet, including aircraft carriers, advanced as far as the waters of Australia, bombing the Allied naval base at Darwin. However, the downside was that achieving so many successive victories against ill-prepared Allied forces made Japan overconfident, and its forces became spread too thinly across the region. In early May 1942, Japan planned to capture Port Moresby with an amphibious assault to isolate Australia and New Zealand from the United States. Japan's aim was to cut off the communication and supply lines between these countries. However, Japan's plan was thwarted by the United States in the Battle of the Coral Sea, when an Allied task force led by 2 U.S. Navy aircraft carriers intercepted the Japanese fleet. In response to American air raids on the main island of Honshu, Japan planned to capture the Midway Atoll and lure American aircraft carriers into battle to destroy them. As a diversion, Japan also sent troops to capture the Aleutian Islands in Alaska.
Japan began implementing its plan in early June. However, the United States had broken the Japanese naval codes in late May. As a result, the U.S. knew the enemy's plans and operational methods in detail. They leveraged this advantage to achieve a crucial victory in the Battle of Midway. This defeat cost the Japanese Navy 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 soldiers killed. As a result, the Japanese Navy's combat capability was severely diminished. Japan tried to salvage the situation by concentrating its forces to capture Port Moresby in the territory of Papua and New Guinea. At the same time, the U.S. planned a counteroffensive to retake the Japanese forward base in the southern Solomon Islands as the first step in a plan to recapture Rabaul, the main Japanese base in Southeast Asia. Both plans were set in motion in July, but by mid-September, Japan decided to prioritize the front on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands and ordered a withdrawal from the Port Moresby area to the northern part of New Guinea. There, Japanese troops clashed with Australian and American forces in the Battle of Buna-Gona. Guadalcanal quickly became a brutal battlefield. Both sides suffered heavy losses in troops and ships during the fierce fighting. Finally, by early 1943, the Japanese were defeated and forced to withdraw from the island. On the mainland, Japanese forces advanced rapidly deep into the British colony of Burma until they met fierce resistance. British Commonwealth forces launched an offensive in the Arakan region in late 1942, but had to withdraw to India in May 1943 after suffering a heavy defeat. By February 1943, Britain shifted to using irregular guerrilla forces to harass the Japanese rear. The Allies seized the initiative and counterattack. After the Guadalcanal campaign ended, the United States began to deploy a series of military operations against Japan in the Pacific. In May 1943, a joint U.S.-Canadian force conducted a military operation on the Aleutian Islands to defeat the Japanese forces there. Following this, the U.S. continuously launched major campaigns on land, at sea, and in the air. The U.S. intention was to isolate the Japanese base at Rabaul by capturing the surrounding islands and to break the defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific at Japan's Gilbert and Marshall Islands. By the end of May 1944, the Allies had accomplished both of these objectives and had also neutralized Japan's key base at Truk in the Caroline Islands. In April, the Allies launched another campaign and successfully retook western New Guinea. In Europe, both Germany and the Soviet Union spent the spring and early summer of 1943 preparing for major offensives in central Russia. On July 4, 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, Germany deployed large armored units in an attempt to turn the tide. Kursk became the largest tank battle in world history. Nazi Germany ultimately mobilized over 3,200 tanks of various types, while the Soviet Union mobilized over 7,300. After 11 days of attacks without breaking through the Soviet defense lines, Hitler was forced to call off the operation. This decision was also influenced by news that Sicily, in southern Italy, was being invaded by Allied forces starting on July 9th, which ultimately led to the overthrow of the fascist government and Mussolini's arrest. During the Battle of Kursk, on July 12th, the Soviet Union launched Operation Kutuzov in the northern sector of the Kursk salient. The counteroffensive lasted until August 18th. The Red Army achieved a major victory, completely shattering the German army's hopes of winning. The defeat at Kursk, combined with the devastating failure in the siege of Stalingrad before it, pushed the German army into a passive position, completely losing the strategic initiative on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Red Army shifted from defense to active offense across the entire front. The German army still tried to stabilize the Eastern Front along the Panther-Wotan line, also known as the Eastern Wall, but the Red Army managed to break through several positions at this line in Smolensk and in a section north of the Black Sea. On September 3, 1943, Allied forces landed on the Italian mainland. The Italian army soon signed a unilateral armistice with the Allies. Germany, with the support of Italian fascist forces loyal to Mussolini, responded by disarming Italian soldiers who were without command. This allowed Germany to quickly gain military control over many areas of Italy and rapidly build a series of defensive lines. Additionally, German special forces rescued Mussolini and then set him up as the head of state of a puppet government called the Italian Social Republic in the north. The Allied armies immediately launched military campaigns to break through several German defensive lines in southern Italy, approaching the main defensive line by mid-November 1943. At sea, the German Navy's military operations were also affected. By May 1943, as Allied countermeasures against the German Navy became increasingly effective, German submarines suffered significant losses, leading to a drastic reduction in their activities in the Atlantic. In November 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met with Chiang Kai-shek in Cairo, and then met with Stalin in Tehran. The Cairo Conference agreed that Japan would have to return all territories it had seized after the war ended, and it outlined military plans for the campaign in Burma. In Tehran, the parties agreed that the Western Allies would launch an offensive against Germany in 1944, and that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. On January 27, 1944, the Soviet Red Army launched an offensive to drive the Germans out of the Leningrad region, lifting the siege of the city after nearly 900 days. The bloodiest siege in world history had ended, with a total of approximately 1.5 million deaths on both sides, including civilians. At the same time, as the Red Army approached the Estonian border, it was halted by the German Army Group North. This delayed subsequent Soviet operations in the Baltic region. By the end of May 1944, the Soviet Union had liberated Crimea and driven most of the Axis forces out of Ukraine. The Soviet Union then continued its attacks into Romanian territory, but was repulsed. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Allies successfully broke through the German defensive line near Rome, and on June 4th, the Allies captured Rome. Also in June 1944, after nearly 3 years of continuous urging from the Soviet Union, the Allies finally decided to open a second front in Europe. On June 6, 1944, Western Allied forces simultaneously landed in the Normandy region of northern France. The operation was extremely fierce. The Allies faced many difficulties and suffered heavy losses despite their superiority in numbers and equipment. However, they gradually gained the upper hand and forced the Germans to withdraw from northern France. The Allies also redeployed several divisions from Italy to attack the Provence region, successfully driving the Germans out of France. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated by the resistance and the Free French forces commanded by Charles de Gaulle. Building on this momentum, the Western Allies continued to push the Germans back on the Western Front for the rest of the year. However, a plan to invade northern Germany, starting with an airborne operation in the Netherlands, failed. The Allies reached the German border but could not break through the final German defense line at the Ruhr River. On the Asia-Pacific front, in March 1944, Japanese forces launched an offensive into Assam, India, quickly surrounding British forces at Impal and Kohima. Japan then launched Operation Ichigo, with the objectives of destroying the main Chinese armies, securing the railway connecting Japanese-occupied territories, and capturing Allied airfields. On June 22, the Soviet Union launched a strategic offensive in Belarus, almost completely destroying Germany's Army Group Center. After this victory, the Red Army continuously launched other military campaigns, driving the Germans out of western Ukraine and eastern Poland. The Soviet Union then established the Polish Committee of National Liberation to control the country's territory and to counter the Armia Krajowa forces loyal to the Polish government in exile in London. The Red Army also did not intervene but merely observed as the Germans crushed the Warsaw Uprising initiated by the Armia Krajowa. In eastern Romania, the Red Army's strategic offensive destroyed a large number of German troops there and also triggered 2 successful coups in Romania and Bulgaria, leading to these 2 countries joining the Allied side. In September 1944, the Red Army entered Yugoslavia, forcing Germany's army groups E and F to hastily withdraw from Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia to avoid being completely isolated. By this time, the resistance forces led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, under the command of Josip Broz Tito, had controlled most of Yugoslavia's territory and were engaged in tying down German troops in the south. In northern Serbia, the Red Army, with relatively limited support from Bulgaria, assisted the resistance in liberating Belgrade on October 20th.
A few days later, the Soviet Union launched a large-scale offensive into Hungary. This campaign ended with the fall of Budapest in February 1945. Despite winning many victories in the Balkan region, the Red Army still faced difficulties in Finland, where the Finns' fierce resistance in Karelia prevented the Soviet Union from occupying the country. Eventually, the two countries signed an armistice with relatively lenient terms, but Finland was still forced to join the Allies to fight against Germany. In the Southeast Asia region, by early July 1944, the British Commonwealth forces in Southeast Asia had successfully repelled the Japanese advance in Assam, forcing the Japanese to retreat to the Chindwin River, while Chinese forces had captured Nichikina. In September, Chinese forces captured Mount Song and opened the Burma Road. Meanwhile, Japanese forces also captured Changsha in mid-June and Hanyang in early August. Japan then continued its attack on Guangxi, winning victories at Guilin and Luzhou in late November, successfully linking its forces in China and Indochina by mid-December.
In the Pacific, American forces continued to push back the Japanese defensive perimeter. In mid-June 1944, American forces recaptured the Mariana and Palau Islands from the Japanese and defeated the Japanese Navy in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. These defeats forced Prime Minister Hideki Tojo to resign and also allowed the U.S. to use air bases for heavy bomber raids on major Japanese cities. By late October, the U.S. had captured the island of Leyte in the Philippines. Afterwards, the Allied Navy won a decisive victory over the Japanese Navy in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was the largest naval battle of World War II and one of the largest naval battles in history. The joint U.S.-Australian forces used a total of over 300 warships of various types, in addition to nearly 1,500 aircraft. On the Japanese side, they deployed over 67 warships of various types and more than 300 aircraft. In this four-day naval battle, the Japanese Navy suffered heavy losses, with over 10,000 soldiers killed and 26 warships lost. Almost all of their aircraft were destroyed. While the U.S.-Australian forces won, they also lost over 3,000 soldiers, 11 warships, and over 250 aircraft. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is also noted as the first battle where Japanese aircraft carried out organized kamikaze suicide attacks. This is why Japan lost most of its aircraft in this battle. The end of the war. On December 16, 1944, Nazi Germany made a final attempt to split the Allied forces on the Western Front. They threw most of their remaining reserves into a major counteroffensive in the Ardennes and along the Franco-German border. Germany hoped that by doing so, they could encircle a large portion of the Allied forces and thereby be able to propose a political solution, avoiding defeat and unconditional surrender. But by January 1945, this German offensive had been repulsed without achieving any of its strategic objectives. Meanwhile, in Italy, Allied forces were still stuck, unable to break through the German defensive lines in the north. In mid-January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula, Oder, and East Prussian offensives with the goal of completely liberating Poland. In the Vistula-Oder offensive, the Red Army shattered Germany's Army Group A, the defensive force on the Warsaw-Berlin axis, liberating the majority of Poland and northern Czechoslovakia. But most importantly, the Red Army had advanced to the doorstep of Berlin, creating a springboard for subsequent campaigns into the capital of Nazi Germany. In the East Prussian offensive, although the Soviet Union suffered considerable losses, it also shattered two German army groups, the Northwest and the left wing of Army Group Center, capturing East Prussia and successfully liberating Poland. On February 4, 1945, the leaders of the US, UK, and Soviet Union met at the Yalta Conference to discuss what would happen after the war ended. This event also led to the formation of the bipolar world order, which was the division of spheres of influence among the major Allied powers. Also in February 1945, the Red Army entered Silesia and Pomerania, while other Allied forces advanced into Western Germany and reached the Rhine River. By March, the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine in the north and the Ruhr in the south, encircling Germany's Army Group B. Also in early March, in a final effort to protect the Hungarian oil fields and recapture Budapest, Germany launched its last major offensive against the Red Army near Lake Balaton. But within 2 weeks, the German attack was repulsed, and the Red Army then captured Vienna. By April, the Soviet Union had captured Königsberg, while the Western Allies finally broke through the German defense line in Italy, advancing to capture both Hamburg and Nuremberg. On April 25th, American and Red Army troops met at the Elbe River. In late April 1945, the Soviet Union entered Berlin. On April 29th, the German forces in Italy surrendered, and the government of the Italian Social Republic also surrendered. 2 days earlier, Mussolini himself had tried to flee, but was captured and executed on April 28th. On April 30th, the Red Army captured the Reichstag building in Berlin, signaling that the end of the German Third Reich had come. On the same day, Hitler committed suicide in his command bunker. On May 7th and 8th, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The war in Europe was over. On the Pacific Front, American and Filipino forces landed on Luzon in January 1945 and liberated Manila in March. Fighting continued on Luzon, Mindanao, and other Philippine islands until the end of the war. American forces also launched a large-scale firebombing campaign against major Japanese cities, with the air raid on Tokyo causing horrific casualties. In May 1945, Australian troops landed on Borneo, seizing the oil fields there. British, American, and Chinese forces defeated the Japanese army in northern Burma by March, and British forces entered Rangoon on May 3rd. Meanwhile, China also launched counteroffensives, gradually pushing the Japanese out of its territory. American forces also captured Iwo Jima in March and Okinawa by the end of June, while the Navy blockaded Japanese waters. On July 17th, the leaders of the three main Allied powers, the US, UK, and Soviet Union, met again at Potsdam. The conference confirmed previous agreements about post-war Germany. At the same time, the UK, US, and China called for Japan's unconditional surrender. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. Japan received this declaration on July 26th, and there were differing reactions among its leadership. While the Japanese government had no specific response, the militarist faction considered the declaration insolent and demanded that the government reject it immediately. On the afternoon of the 28th, at a press conference, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki said he would refrain from commenting on the declaration and that Japan would continue the war. Therefore, the United States decided to proceed with the option they had previously formulated, using atomic bombs to force Japan to surrender. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively, almost completely destroying the 2 cities and killing tens of thousands of people instantly, not to mention the hundreds of thousands who were affected and died slow, agonizing deaths in the following years. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan and attacked Manchuria, defeating Japan's Kwantung Army there. On the night of August 9th, early morning August 10th, Emperor Hirohito proposed unconditional surrender. At noon on the 15th, Japanese radio stations simultaneously broadcasted the emperor's message, calling on all forces to surrender. On the 17th, the surrender order was given to Japanese troops still scattered across Japan and abroad. Finally, on September 2nd, Japan officially signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. World War II, a conflict on a global scale, was the greatest man-made catastrophe in history. 70 million dead, countless people injured and disabled both physically and mentally, and hundreds of millions more affected.
The world order was completely changed, and so many generations were impacted by this war. The influence of this war likely still exists to this very day. And that was the entire content of the article. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the Spy Room YouTube channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss similar content in the future. I'm Vietang, and for now, goodbye.